Good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased tonight to be introducing Ezra Shales, who was actually a student here while I was a visiting professor. So we were just reminiscing about the fact that that was 15 years ago. And I don't know whether it makes Ezra feel old, but it certainly makes me feel old. Nevertheless, it's delightful to see someone who was in the position of a student in the BGC coming back to speak in many respects about all the things he has done, the career path that he's taken since leaving the BGC, which really is rather impressive. He is currently a professor at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design, and he has published a great deal. His first major book was Made in Newark, which was substantially composed from material that he worked on for his PhD in the Bard Graduate Centre. And he's currently working on a new book on craft, which is to be published by Reaction and the University of Chicago Press. He's also been very active in organising exhibitions, partly through his first position where he was a professor at Alfred College, which specialises in ceramics, and he organised a series of exhibitions, one notably on women ceramicists, and he has recently been working on the exhibition Pathmakers, Women in Art, Craft and Design for the Museum of Arts and Design. But perhaps most interestingly, certainly for me, is that he tells me he's currently preparing for publication, for republication, David Pye's famous books on craft and design, which I think it's fair to say are probably better known in Britain than they are here, but certainly Pye has become a great touchstone for writings and research on craft and design, and Ezra will be writing an introduction to the republication of these. So it's quite interesting to see the way that what began as his studies in the Bard Graduate Centre have moved through teaching, through curating, and indeed to publishing in aspects on the history of craft and design that I certainly see as central to the Bard Graduate Centre's mission, and therefore very encouraging to be able to introduce Ezra to speak on aspects of this career trajectory, which started, if not exactly in this room, certainly in this building, and indeed has moved to various parts of what we see as the career and profession of scholarship in the area of craft and design. So allow me to introduce Ezra Shales. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So I was told that the number of students would outnumber the number of faculty, but that's not the case in this room. So, but I thought I would talk, in some ways, I put together an autobiographical talk. So it doesn't quite start with what happened in this room or started in this building, but it does reflect on that. The title is an acknowledgement also of a great movie by David Shapiro, which itself is about a Tobias Schneebaum book about going up the Amazon and living with in the wilds. So I thought it would be nice in some ways to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about a few different things as research and question what I do as research. I think a lot of what I do is often useless research. And I think I've often wrestled with that, and so it's curious. And I thought we'd start with a question. Who in the room can identify this? You all know it, I assure you.
Is it from the Wedgwood Forum book?
Close, it's close, yeah. It's a print I actually bought at the flea markets back in 1992 as a torn out sheet But I didn't really, I admired it for years. I have it on my wall, but I didn't know what it was until I came here. And that's kind of interesting in terms of this process of buying things like this. I thought I'd start off with that, this notion of buying a torn out sheet that's unmarked at the flea market stall, or even more embarrassingly, and this is what happens when you go to your parents' house if your parents run a museum of everything you've ever made and have not thrown it out. You see things like this, a lovely dragon. I guess that foretells learning how to tell stories or just purely reading fantasy. And then this, an ashtray, which I picked up, and the underside of it says, I'm not sure if you can read it out, it says, I actually inscribed it when I made it, dumb old ashtray, quotation marks, foreshadowing the Trumpian quotation marks, I suppose, Joe. It says the second time using the wheel and hopefully the last time. So I think there's this enticement of what it is to work with materials and the enjoyment of materials, and yet I don't know what that is, but that's interesting in terms of material engagement, I think, and trying to work out what things mean. I grew up with this book on my shelf, and it's probably the first book I read as a genuinely good academic, which is, I saw the cover, I liked the cover. I thought, I love the George Washington Bridge. I live nearby the George Washington Bridge, and I grew up right up a mile away from here. And I read the author's introduction, which is very much a celebration of the vernacular construction of things in America. And then I flipped to the index, that's being a good academic, right? And found out where he talked about the George Washington Bridge and what his argument was. And I thought, in some ways, it's a very shrill argument in terms of kind of refuting European culture or incursions of European culture into America. But as an Americanist, it also was, I think, both the bridge and the book very much spoke to me. And I think this is my writing my book, Made in Newark, was very much an homage to thinking through this in terms of going back to mechanics, thinking about a built environment and taking the built environment seriously. I think often academics say everything is worth serious study, but then we often, I'd say, don't treat everything seriously. So the person who takes the George Washington Bridge seriously sometimes says, oh, fashion, and scoffs at that. So the first serious artist I met was Freedom. And this is, I thought, I just found this online, and I hunted for this for years. This is his tag. And I think it's great to just say that, first of all, this is almost a self-portrait of a graffiti artist as James Dean, even though it's really supposed to be a portrait of James Dean. And it's great because it's already got a museum label. It's got a label here to the lower left which says, Freedom to Write, James Dean piece, copyright, Freedom. So I just think it's interesting to think about this built environment of New York City, and I think in some ways it's a very entitled childhood I have in admiring this guy, learning from him, and then also my sense of the city as a kind of fabric was also very important to think through in terms of a sense of disrepair in the city, but also a sense of how history should be layered. And instead of treating Grant's tomb with too much respect, my older sibling was actually engaged in kind of erecting these tiles around it. And so this sense that these benches, which are all around the monument today, were a contribution. They're very kind of Gaudi-esque benches by a Chilean artist made in the early 70s. And so this also was interesting to me to think about, thinking about cities and the background of admiring these tiles, I would say, more than Grant's tomb, or the graffiti artist and the graffiti on the tomb more than the tomb itself, even though, of course, I love Stanford White and McKimmey White in general. The interest, I'd say, is also in a kind of social participatory aspect of art, and that's very kind of hot these days, and I'm often wrestling with that in terms of student interests. as well as the where fine art is these days. When I went to Rome, I studied classical archaeology as an undergraduate. And this was one of the most compelling objects in Rome, the Pasquino, this notion of a speaking statue, of a live bit of history, which was still spray painted when I was there. I also had an entitled childhood, I'd say, in that I had a high school art teacher who was a member of the Guerrilla Girls. So this is a very recent photo of the Guerrilla Girls. But that thinking about art was really all around me. I was a dog walker for several remarkable people, one of whom was an artist, one of whom was an art historian. And in some interesting way, I've been juggling these two acts of theirs, as well as totally been ensconced in their taste. So I think in some ways it's very interesting to write this book about craft for a reaction. I found myself going back to these touchstones in order to, I don't know, maybe to be argumentative, but also in order to write with conviction and enthusiasm about material culture, which is what I do have a great fondness for. So in these people's apartment, when I was a kid, there was a sink mounted on the wall. There were vases on the floor, an amphora, and there was this wonderful wood screw on the right, which was a tool, but obviously was a tool that it was kind of, a 6-foot-high tool inside their house that I wrestled with in terms of thinking through its beauty, its remarkable qualities, and its interesting kind of qualities in terms of how it's made. It's not marked, so when is it made? And I think this interesting issue of the making being always present in how I'm thinking, and whether the making is research and whether the dog walking is research when you're going into people's apartments and snooping through their books, it does kind of bubble up in interesting ways. And when I looked at these Brancusi photographs, I immediately was drawn to the fact that he had this object, or one of these wood screws, in his studio, and had fun seeing how it cropped up in lots of different images. And yet always I went back to my connection to such an object. What is it? Did I admire it as an antiquarian object? Did I already think through how is this made? How are screws made? When are screws standardized? When is this made on the lathe? Is this made just with calipers and chisels? There's a lot to think about there. And also, was it, is it an American antique? Was it brought overseas? So I find myself thinking through these objects and wrestling with them in interesting ways. I also, before I came to the BGC, was active as an artist, quote unquote, right? And it was already thinking about houses and home and furniture, but in this sort of way. And I think that's interesting too for me, because in my field, in our field, the kind of the role of contemporary art always is something that I feel weighs down upon objects too much, and weighs down upon the field because it's where the money is, it's where this interest is. And I feel always that I've kind of understood contemporary art, but then moved from there to decorative arts and design. And I think that's an interesting part to reflect on in terms of a journey. So this was a piece I did out in the far Rockaways when it was a different landscape and culture. I made 10,000 of these postcards, which were addressed to the site. They built on research I was doing at the time on Native American works, and the kind of story or narrative, fragmented poetic things I've picked up there are definitely lifted from invocations to homes and prayers for homes. So this was interesting, and this was, is this research? What does it add up to? It was interesting to do as a process. I realized I had to mow the field. It was public engagement on some level, but it was also it's part of my story, I feel, in terms of thinking through cities once again, and how we colonize cities, what's a marginal space in a city. So yes, when I came here, I worked very much on the Newark Library and Museum Association. I did come to the BGC with this topic, and even though that was considered ill-advised, I would advise anyone going to get a dissertation to have their topic beforehand, and because it's too strange a kind of career to embark on if you don't actually have that as an underpinning, a kind of a hunch that you're following, I would say. The Newark's museums, exhibitions also enticed me because they were also performative. They were about manufacturing and making. And so I think that notion of objects and making objects, and here you see Enoch Bourne demonstrating for students how ceramics is made. There were pageants in Newark like this, which were referencing brick production and tile production, and actually the way ceramic clay kind of interacts in terms of plates. So there's a kind of microscopic, and then there's also these biblical layers kind of collided there in terms of the myth of manufacturing. When I was here, I was also still working on other research, right? And living in Brooklyn, I passed this plaque every day. And if you notice, there's no tree. And it says, this tree is dedicated to the memory of Private Clifford B. King, Ordnance Department, who died in the World War. And I had passed this plaque for years since I lived there, starting in 1992. And this became an exhibition that I contributed to the Brooklyn Museum, but for years I was actually just doing research on Cliff King, figuring out how he died, and sadly he didn't even make it to France to be in the engagement there, or maybe that's a good thing. But to do this kind of intervention on the streets and this reflection of objects was interesting because it led me into this research about Eastern Parkway and how there were actually 400 plaques like this, which were memorials, which were kind of tree plantings, but which were also entrepreneurial activities, selling to these selling memorials to these parents of these deceased soldiers. So here again, this is kind of interesting because it's a project in a museum that it's about local culture around. It's about the city's fabric. It's about the fact that there aren't these trees out there. It's the fact that acknowledging the fact that this is a history that's unacknowledged, that's underappreciated, and also, of course, at the time we're in the middle of another war too. So it was intended to be reflective and provocative about that. It was a lovely project, most of all, I'd say, because people picked up these posters and took them with them. Again, I killed 5,000 trees or whatever it took to make 5,000 posters. And a teacher named Mildred Coleman actually picked these up and brought her students they made a pilgrimage to the plaque. And then they started this letter writing campaign to the Parks Department. And she was covered. She received wonderful coverage in the press. And then I was invited as a kind of spectator, kind of guest of honor, to come when they replanted a tree for Cliff B. King down on Eastern Parkway. And it was this kind of reenactment, but was also a kind of celebration of multicultural heritage in the city. And wonderful because they played taps. So there was this kind of pageantry that I could participate in, even though I didn't get up on stage. I didn't say anything. So it was interesting to do this while I was actually conducting my research on Newark and on New Jersey textiles and thinking about what they meant. And again, here, more demonstrations inside the museum based on this notion of making is knowing, or doing is learning. John Dewey, classical constructivist education idea. Newark was interesting and compelling to me because it was also entrepreneurial, it was artistic, it was industrial, and it was also very much about civic engagement. And so all of these kinds of wheels I see as still turning. This is a wonderful project I worked on here, and this is how I came to understand that this plate is part of Donkerville's publications, but we always see the color images. We very rarely see these very schematic images. So it was lovely to look back in my house and understand, that I had been learning from this before, and that I had somehow been attuned to this before, whether it's as ceramics, whether it's as design, or simply this notion of making. I have to also acknowledge another wonderful artist, Neil Brownsword. He was apprenticed at age 15 to Wedgwood, and he brought me into Wedgwood's factory. So while here at Bard, we went to the Met, and we had wonderful tours and hands-on sense of learning. This satisfied me in a much deeper way to go meet Neil Bennett and talk to this fellow. He's working on a tool from 1780, and it's a rope-turned tool that actually cuts. Basically, it's engine turning, developed by the Ehlers brothers in the 1690s. But here, Wedgwood is using it still today to cut these pieces. And Neil Bennett was the only person who's trained. So Neil Brownsword gave me this tour, and Neil Bennett was wonderful because he actually said, "Now you try it." And that physical kind of challenge, it was quite exciting because here I had to turn that rope, and it is a rope that you're pulling. You've got to pull it fast enough so that the wheel keeps going forward and the cam, cuts evenly. So if you do it too fast, it chatters. But if you pull the rope too slowly, then the wheel goes back on you. And it also is a way. So it's kind of interesting in terms of where the study of ceramics took me in terms of exciting other places from here. It took me to Wedgwood Factory. It took me into the Noguchi archives, looking at ashtrays, one of my favorite objects. But I always found it very hard. Of course, this is one of those things that everyone says, oh, everything is worthy of serious research. But then ashtrays? You're going to give us a lecture on ashtrays? You always come up against interesting walls. So if it's not Noguchi's ashtrays, then it's Stig Lindberg's wonderful ashtrays. And these were great to go through and actually conduct research in Gustavsberg a couple of years ago. When I landed this job in Alfred, as Paul is talking about, I then started going to other factories nearby to look at how ceramic insulators like these are made, and they're made just like your keys are copied. And I put together an exhibition there of local goods, which I called raw goods, because the idea is that these were extracted kind of from the factory line before they're in the state of purely being a refinished product. So this was interesting because there were no museums nearby. And for some terrible reason, the ceramics people thought that it was terrible to go to the glass museum nearby, which is wonderful, Corning. They have those material boundaries. So this was a way to kind of, again, overcome some parochial boundaries, but also overcome these issues of thinking through, is where you are a kind of a hindrance, an obstacle, or can you actually turn it around and find something interesting there? So we visited a number of factories where there were these elegant solutions. Some of these are fragments from Boston Valley Terracotta, which renovates New York City subways. They also make some kind of cladding, which is modern cladding. The glass forms close by are part of ITT Precision Optics Labs, where they actually make the South African Large Telescope and things like that. And those are water jet cutouts of glass. So those are their remnants. And then there was Cutco, which makes military-grade knives. So this kind of idea of the kinesthetic process of actually going into the factories and relating to that manual labor, and then also thinking of the aesthetics of use, the aesthetics of the finished object, I tried to bring into the gallery too. This was also an interesting battle where these objects were referred to as Ezra's petting zoo. But I really felt very committed to the idea that the objects were just as important, and they did allow that tactile access. And so it was not an easily won battle, but it was interesting to me. This is the poster. This is the Kohler factory. I think it's a little bit out of order. So Paul mentioned these exhibitions that I worked on for a few years. And this I started at Alfred, looking at its archive. And it was amazing to think of the history there. When I went to the dean and I proposed this to the dean, to look at women, and largely the women who taught at Alfred in the earlier half of the century as opposed to more recently, she said, "Hasn't that been done? That's such an 80s idea." To go back and look at these women's contributions. And it was amazing because there was a gallery named after Marianne Fosdick, who made these two large white vases, urns. And we had a gallery named after them, but these had never been exhibited. And no one knew what they were from. So conducting oral histories with graduates who were then octogenarians, and who have now died since I did the research, we realized that these two vases, these two white vases, were sent down to the World's Fair in 1939 and exhibited there. But Marianne Fosdick was humble enough so that she told her students that when she went to go find them, she found them outside the lavatories filled with sand and being used as ashtrays. So it was lovely to get those oral histories and to think through, what these objects mean, and piece through the institutional history, to read her diary of walking through this town when it was gaslit the lights, the street lights were gaslit in the 19-teens and 20s, and what the life of this, unmarried art professor was like. She grew up in a much less provincial area, and she ended up in this strange little town, as I knew myself firsthand. The wonderful thing about doing exhibitions like this in little places which no one sees is that you have a totally free hand, right? And really, I think the visitation was very low for this, but that's okay. Because I could juxtapose freely what I wanted to do, and I could actually compose and design the wall labels, and present unknowns, present very well-known people's work, but not maybe their best-known work by them. And that was interesting for me. We also produced a lovely catalog, and it was a great avenue to actually connect with all of these people who I'd met at conferences for the last 10 years and get them to contribute to this project. Because really, if no one's going to come to the exhibition or see the exhibition because it's out there in this hinterlands, you want to have a catalog to make it enduring or lasting or not as a monument, but in order to actually pose any real questions. Posing a question to a wall isn't that valuable. So asking questions of these objects and putting people together who were not normally put together was a lot of fun for me. And it really, again, it helped me challenge this notion of what is American art. Yet again, here you're seeing Maria Martinez pictured with Enrico Fermi. And instead of situating her as the kind of, the native who's outside of America, I'm putting her right into the the atomic age there, and Eva Zeisel as well. Of course, you can read Pat on Zeisel. And I did read on Eva Zeisel thanks to knowing Pat. And so, but Zeisel herself is often situated in outside of ceramics, I'd say, as design. So to pull her back into this mix was something fun. And then finally to put things like what you see on the far right, 2 pots that the Metropolitan Museum of Art bought in 1940, but have never been exhibited together since, and to show that those 2 pots, the only 2 pieces of pottery bought out of the most prestigious ceramics show at the time, the Syracuse National, were by women, and one of those was, of course, an Alfred teacher, Marian Fosdick. The other is Maya Grotel, who was at Cranbrook for years. So this is in some ways interesting because it's my chance to do this in some ways was a chance to acknowledge that it had been done before, which is a great thing too. So to go back to 1940 at Syracuse Museum, both Zeisel and Martinez were exhibited as Americans, not one as an immigrant and one as an indigenous. So this notion of kind of conducting this research, thinking through the institutional research, was all fun, as well as going up and photographing Eva Zeisel's Riverside Drive house, where and realizing that the ironwork outside influenced her decoration, even though that's not her drawing. She was friends with the Danish artist who did it, Erik Blokvad, I think, and they consciously used that as a motif after having tea at her studio. It was also a pleasure to work on this show, Pathmakers. Also down now for 2 years, but rather recent still. And what was interesting is that really the 2 shows were up at the same time, but that the Alfred show came first as an idea. Then I dropped it when I got the bigger fish of the New York City show. And then once I realized that I was not going to be able to exert any curatorial control that I think mattered over the Mad show, I went back and did the Alfred show. So I think that's an interesting thing for students to think about in terms of control and thinking through what your contribution is and what a contribution can be. I'm going to skip through a bunch of these. I was very happy to help the Museum of Arts and Design buy these Karen Carn stools, which were deaccessioned from the Johnson collection. And while I was doing this, I just want to show you on the right. This is what I was doing on the side. These are my own little investigations into this notion of ceramic stools. And my children were rolling their eyes at me thinking, this is stupid. My wife was equally thought this notion of investigating the objects and thinking through, what's comfortable seat in ceramics, what's not, how does it work. Also, was questioning this level of time but it's very interesting to cast a 50-pound bag of plaster into a mold, and to think through that as opposed to coiling as a technique, and to feel the different qualities of stoneware, helpful in order to think through how the object functions, and also to think, why am I drawn to this? I knew I was actually thinking of the Castiglionis in the back of my head. I had this dream also of sending this down as a joke to Ken Ames for his retirement chair, the Honorable Ken Ames retirement chair. Those tractor seats are meant to mount on an upright wheel instead of a steel spring. But I thought they were the perfect garden furniture, and if you know Ken, you know he likes raising tomatoes. It's also interesting to think about failures, I think. So the idea of kind of coming down here and saying, "Oh, I've done such great things," I thought was kind of a little bit bizarre to do. So I thought it was also interesting to throw out the failures you have. So this is an exhibition that looked like it was going to go through and come to fruition last year. I was flown down to a museum twice in North Carolina. But then when the whole issue of gendered bathrooms came up, the toilet show became a hot button issue. And that was interesting to think of. You know, you've kind of, you feel like you've climbed the mountain, you've got these kind of interviews going. And the exhibition, I think, is still worth doing. Maybe one of you will do it. The idea was really thinking through highbrow and lowbrow. So immediately when you came in, I wanted you to see this wonderful vaso de noche, which is solid silver, a Bolivian object. So some kind of provincial patron with a very high sense of self-esteem. Obviously, I've never seen another solid silver bed chamber pot like this. And then also to put next to that a bed, and sticking out from under the bed this much more lowly earthenware object, chipped, kind of mangled by history and use. And for me, this was an object or a show that could be interesting. It was also going back to Newark and the lessons I learned from Newark, where the idea of having an exhibition was that it would be an exhibition of both industrial objects, artistic objects, and historical objects. So the toilet as totem and taboo could actually span these different genres, but it's very challenging also to span those genres, I'd say. So I loved kind of advertisements like this for the hot red toilet. There are many more of these. I thought it'd be a great way to include some contemporary art like this, which actually does think through the kind of deep fear and kind of worries over anxieties over hygiene. I hope some of you saw this in the retrospective. It was a great experience when I saw this at the DIA years ago, and this issue of whether these objects are handmade or modeled or crisp is interesting. And then it is a pressing issue today, actually. So to think through how toilet design has largely, in a sense, plateaued since 1910, and we're all living as if there's just as much water for everyone else in the world to follow this model of engagement. And so, doing research around Boston, I went to MIT and other places to think through what innovation is going on out in, for Haiti, for victims of different kind of natural disasters, and then also local kind of, there's one slide missing here, but local initiatives also to make public bathrooms more accessible, again in this country, because it is actually, as much as it might be a kind of a bungled political issue, it's actually a serious civic problem, and again a serious way we've actually undone a lot of the great achievements of the Victorian city. And then there's lots of fun stuff, right? To think about the institutionalization of the toilet and as a commercial venture. So if anyone goes to Japan, please bring me back one of these lovely little poop emoji hats. It's children learning how a toilet works, right? And in case the BGC is interested in this idea, as far-fetched as it sounds, there's also room for some connoisseurship here, and thinking about how antiquarianship can fit into the admiration of the bed, the chamber pot too. To kind of close and wrap it up, I've been thinking very much about basketry recently, and in some ways this book that Paul mentioned, for Reaction, a kind of survey of craft, which I never intended to write, and which I'm very lucky to be asked to write, really pulled me, and it was an exercise involving, it made me go back and reflect on that cider press or whatever it was in terms of the wood screw. It was a way to kind of pull my research in many different factories together. But this, most of all, I'd say, seems the most pressing and interesting to me, because in terms of working on basketry and thinking about basketry, I realized basketry isn't taught at my school. I've never been at a school with basketry. So one chapter of my book is a kind of as an attempt to think up that institutional identity of basketry, was to contrast basketry or weaving with welding, and to think, oh, in the 20th century, this new genre, welding, goes right into academia via vocational schools, but also via artists like Picasso and Gonzalez and Caro and others, whereas basketry still lingers on the outside. I didn't even touch. Oh, it's my Microsoft. There we go. Okay, sorry. Apologies to the many viewers online. This is attending a kind of a workshop with a lovely Danish basket maker who works in willow. And his primary role out there institutionally is to make facsimiles of Roman willow basketry. But he also does workshops and teaches people. And in my own research on basketry, I was fascinated that basketry had been taught at all the settlement houses around Boston. It was also something that then, the production got taken up in prisons, and that kind of changed the landscape as well. But I was really drawn to it because I had never studied it before. So in some interesting way, this was like starting all over again as an amateur or a dilettante or serving a new apprenticeship of sorts in a different material, and that was fascinating and very attractive to me. And I think basketry is fascinating. Number one, because I went to see exhibitions like at the Renwick had a wonderful survey of basketry where they included the work of Jennifer Zurich and others. But also over time and going into museums, I had taken photographs of baskets and objects of wonder. Here, a Swedish flask made of birch bark, and here I won't quiz you on whether you know what this is. This is a rat trap. So where an animal would get stuck going up, just kind of like those old finger toys that you used to have. So thinking through the myriad kind of uses of basketry, and as well as the institutional identity of it in art schools and museums. And then, of course, there's this pressing issue of ecological kind of use of art materials and sustainability. So my interest in schooling, and here is a kind of one of these normal schools, teaching schools, very much here. You have to talk about issues of class and issues of race and issues of kind of teaching basketry to people like the blind. All of these ways basketry has been institutionalized in the 20th century was largely using kind of very impoverished or underserved communities, I guess is our current parlance. But then it is this awesome thing as well to think about the scale of basketry and the myriad uses of it in terms of really industrialization. This is harvesting fish, of course, in the 19th century. So basketry is, in its broadest sense, was interesting to me, and interesting, I think, because it also got beyond these boundaries of taste or of global and local and distinguishing cultural sources. It's very, very tricky to kind of to suggest and to look at two eel baskets. It's quite tricky. You can't actually know. To look at two contemporary bamboo baskets made in two different corners of the world really challenges the connoisseur as well as the tinkerer, I think. And then I also was looking at really banal objects locally. These sell at IKEA for $69. The Gullholmen chair designed by Maria Vinca. I sat in these at IKEA, of course, and that's how I read the label, and they tell you who the designer is, and then you can Google the designer's name. So that this kind of name I gave to the talk, Keep the Research On Your Right, is this interesting thing of like, where do you put that trip to IKEA? Do you kind of say, oh, it's just a trip to IKEA, I am getting a cheap this or that? Or do you think of it as yet again a place where your curiosity is going to intersect with other avenues of questioning. Do you segregate this by taste or by class or by value, or do you actually make those walls porous, or what makes those walls porous? So I really shouldn't probably put this image up there because this is a screen grab on Skype without the designer's consent, so forgive me. But I think it is interesting to think about, contacting such people and asking them, what is your inspiration? What were you thinking about when you made that design? The joy of talking to contemporary producers cannot be underestimated in terms of thinking through these objects. And then following that up by calling the factory producer in Vietnam and saying, well, how much are these people paid, and how many do they make a day, and how long does it take, and all of that is research worth conducting and thinking through. So I'm not sure if I fulfilled my obligations of a good 45 minutes, but I heartily welcome questions. This is my book. Maybe I'll be invited back to not do a toilet show, but to talk about this book again. You can actually do a workshop where you tell me what I got wrong, because I'm sure I'm going to get something wrong. But The Shape of Craft is very much indebted to, it's built upon the research I did here, but also thinking through research in the most broadest, in the broadest way. It's also indebted to a book, George Kubler's Shape of Time. So there's nothing new in this book, but it's fun to it's been fun to do, and then it's also been fun to think through, this object that I encountered when I was 10 years old, and really to worry over, am I ridiculous to include this as a serious object of research, or if it's the prism through which I see Brancusi and 10 other issues of agricultural manufacture, whether it's worth taking seriously. So thank you.
The lights up, Ezra. Well, thanks. Someone's already done that. A fascinating journey through your career, if you like, but also a reminder of the ways in which a lot of the research is done not with books or in the library, but when you're going to IKEA or when you're in someone else's house.
Or in storage rooms at the Met.
So, are there any questions while we're here? Please.
Hi. So I'll introduce myself because I'm a guest here. I think it's quite a small company. My name is Ellen Chesnova. I'm a latter stage grad student at the University of Italian Switzerland in Switzerland, and I happen to be in campus too. You mentioned that you studied archaeology at the beginning of your academic path. Could you expand a little bit more about how that influenced your engagement with material culture?
Yeah, I think I was. You can't go to kind of Rome and climb up Mount Testaccio without thinking about the amphora and the potter. So I think that was I tried to kind of allude to that in terms of the Pasquino and things like that. But still in archaeology, I think I came even more abruptly up against this wall between European archaeology and American archaeology in terms of theories, but also in terms of methods and criteria. So I think that it was a transition for me away from book learning too. I didn't want to translate Ovid anymore. I love Ovid, but I didn't want to sit in a room and translate Ovid. I wanted to think more about the fabric of the city and encounter objects and physical things.
I'm hoping you can talk a little bit more about this most recent project, The Shape of Craft. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
I'm not sure I've got my sound bite yet.
Okay.
I never will have a sound. I never have a sound. So I'm not that kind of person. But like I said, I never imagined writing it, and so it's a wonderful, people that's, I've been pitching other book ideas, and everyone said, "Who's your reader?" And I said, "The average reader." And they said, "That doesn't exist anymore." And then they called me up and they said, And I said, who's your reader? Because I'd already been turned down for these other books, and they said, average reader, layperson. I said, so you don't want a textbook? And they're like, no, we want something polemic, argumentative. And so, and I said, well, can it be a personal essay? What can I juggle here? How far can I roam? So the book very much is organized in terms of, in some ways I did think of my students as my reader, to try and break, to think of, well, what are the issues in art schools and design schools and craft schools, because I've been in all these different schools that identify themselves all these different ways. How can I get all of those readers? Or, cast a broad net. It's broken down in terms of what, who, in terms of who's a craftsperson, then what is the material we think of as craft, and that's a chapter that's about basketry and welding, because I think welding is where we tend to drift to think, we get this kind of questions of, is it a natural material, or is it an artificial material, or is it an industrial material? So those are the first two chapters, and then the last two chapters are where do we think of craft taking place, and then when, time, when do we think of craft? Because craft is always identified generally as something that's happened in the past, and that's thrown against the industrial present. And so, I definitely owe a lot to my colleagues, like Alyssa, who have been on panels with me over the last 5 or 6 or 8. But I think there are many different people working out there today whose ideas I take in and who see it as part of that larger discussion. But it really is, when I thought, how am I going to organize this? I did think of Alan Crawford's, lecture to me once over in a pint in a pub, where he said, you just have to answer those 4 questions. Who, what, when, and where. And then, of course, the joke is with craft is that everything's about how. So I didn't feel I had to answer that 5th question. That roughly gives it the book. And then I also try and break down. I kind of honor medium specificity while I try and kind of break down those boundaries. And I kind of honor craft as different than design, but my book could be called The Shape of Design, too, or The Shape of Material Culture. That gives you a sense.
So thank you. That was a really great tour of your work. You mentioned your students, and so I was wondering if you could share some of the ways that you bring these kind of orientations to craft and making into your work with students.
I actually almost put this on in the presentation because it's wonderful. This student got back in touch with me because he sent me this fantastic work he did, where he how do I do? What do I do? View. How am I going to make this visible for them? Enter full screen or slideshow? Let's see. Oh, it works. Okay. No. Is it? I can't show it. Is John gone?
Yeah, here, let me see.
Let's see if I hit
I
play.
think they can see the edge of the file earlier before you.
You can see the edge of it. Okay, let me see if I can just try and drag it out there. Okay, here we go. Can you dim the lights a little? Otherwise, it's just going to look like a grilled cheese sandwich. So here's a student, Adam Morosky, who was a student at Alfred, who made this incredible piece. It was a performance piece where, for his thesis show, he made grilled cheese sandwiches with, as you can see, a griddle that had the shape of Virgin Mary's face. But I think this interesting kind of everyday culture, and he's preserved this from 2006, and it hasn't rotted. He said he sent this to me. Kind of wonderful. It says it shrank about 3/4 of an inch. But I think students pose questions, and you got it? Thank you. They pose questions. They challenge you. I was telling Paul, one of my students, we're looking at a kind of 19th century clock, and he asked me a couple weeks ago, so is this real gold leaf, or when did they invent fake gold paint? Teaching can be great in terms of questions like that. I also am going to repeat something else because I'm talked out.
All right,
But I think questions like that come out when you go to objects more. And when you're teaching and you teach texts, if it's a really, I mean, if it's Ovid or Hawthorne, people come up with interesting questions. But if you're teaching, let's say, even if it's a text you love, like George Kugler, unfortunately, the same questions get asked in a way that when you go out there into the world and encounter objects or think through factories, or you take a bunch of students into Cutco knives and they have lunch with the people who are working on the line, and they're all asking those people, what's craft, or what in your work is craft, they get much different answers. And you're going unscripted, really, and that's important, I think. It's not all texts in some ways gets the authority shifts in a different way that isn't as provocative, I think, or spontaneous. It could be just the athleticism of walking the students. Students did tell me that they should get gym credit for my classes because we walked through the museum. But yeah, that's all right. Go.
Sorry, I was thinking, and thanks for the great talk, but do you both have art history and fine art students, or, throughout your teaching career?
Yeah.
And what have the differences been in what you include in your curriculum, and how do you think that these two groups are different and kind of the approach to material culture and art? It's a huge question.
Yeah, I mean, I've largely taught in art schools, so Parsons, a wonderful stint up at summer school at NASCAD, Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, and then Alfred is a school of art and design where you have liberal arts students. And then at Mass Art, we do have art history majors, but thank you for coming. But I would say, I mean, there's a whole litany of kind of, generalizations you can make, which are generally true, of course, about the art student different from the art history student or the liberal arts student. But I don't know if those generalizations are worth making, or if you really just as a teacher you've got to kind of go your own route. So all of those groups could benefit from last week I just took students to the Boston Common and we looked at the Shaw Memorial or the Monument to the 54th, which I want to talk about, and just reading Lowell aloud to them there, and then asking us all to read it together. Those are kind of like physical engagements with the world that all of those students can benefit from. And even though the people have been to the Boston Common before, they hadn't looked at it. They hadn't thought through. So, and Boston's interesting to do that in because it's like an endless third grade social studies trip.
It's really interesting, Ezra. And what you're saying, your reluctance to kind of categorize students of a certain sort, art history students different from, is also a reflection, I think. You were talking about research, and is this research or is this something else? What category, where do I put it? It's really research without walls. That's really sort of, it seems to be what you're interested in. And it's really cutting across so many different things. And I'm wondering if you've ever personally, at what point do you engage, what role does history, or the history of these things, or the history of a particular material, or how does that fit into the way you approach something, or especially something new when you take on something new? Because it's a fascinating and sort of upended way to really see the world. I mean, it's a very different and unique vision. It's amazing.
Well, you ruin the dice a lot, I'd say, but I mean, I'm going to do the most challenging thing I've ever done in the fall, which is there are these people, Rick and Laura Brown, who teach at Mass Art in the sculpture department. And they've done interesting projects before where they recreate lifting of an obelisk for Discovery Channel. More of their own choice and I think inclination was a project they just did of repainting and recreating a whole roof of a synagogue that was burnt in the 20th century, and going back and looking at the photo archive that had built up, and actually traveling around through Europe and getting people to build this object, even though they knew nothing about synagogues. They're both from the South. They learned how to kind of make their own tools and stuff like that. So their kind of group, and there's a wonderful movie that was made about them. It's called Hands House Studios. There's a movie called Raise the Roof. That roof that they made is actually going to be part of Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimlet's museum over in Poland, because this is a Polish synagogue, which is, there's no examples of them anymore. So their method of not knowing anything about what you're teaching is something I'm going to take on, much to the consternation of my colleagues, I think, because Rick asked me to team teach a class on the banjo with him in the fall, where the students actually are going to be making banjos, and then my course is kind of like, the banjo as American material culture or African American material culture. I really don't. I know nothing. I don't play the banjo. I don't. So I think it is interesting to do the research without walls. I mean, is it that, I don't know, it's like following your nose too? Maybe I'm really just having a midlife crisis with my commitment to basketry, I don't know. I don't know which one it is. In some ways, to do this, it was interesting as an exercise. I was like, oh, it all goes back to that dumb dragon in that ashtray. As a kind of interest in storytelling and object making, but knowing you're not a professional this or that on some level, but also the cubbies as they exist, being containers that you don't fit into. So that is a kind of an understanding of the institutions as well as the self.
I just have a question about raw goods. How did you cultivate these individuals from the various workshops and factories? Was that a difficult challenge from a curatorial point of view, or was this something is this another part of your sort of skill set?
No, I took Herbert Reed's book's title, which is Art as Industry, and I taught a class that was called Art as Industry for 2 semesters. And over that time, in the summers, I would go and I'd look for new factories to go to. But for that course, actually, that's all it was. It was 1 day a week, and it was driving to a factory to interview people, and then conduct readings also and writings. But a lot of it was built about doing that.
So you made those connections just through the class? I
had made those connections through the class for 2 years, and some places I weren't going to make it into the exhibition, and some places did. But it's an area of such blight, and in Western New York, where you have these opera houses, these towns with opera houses that once had opera houses, but they don't even have. I mean, some of them don't even have separate liquor stores and pornography stores. It's all in one. If that's the only business on Main Street, it's astonishing in terms of how you think that was civilization then, and this is civilization now. But there are these wonderful factories. Some of them I didn't include. Gunlock is out there in Wayland, New York. Jans Rissam made chairs for them, and different other people went to Gunlock and made chairs that have ended up in the Museum of Modern Art and stuff like that. So it's just amazing at how much is out there really once you start looking off of, or once you're stuck somewhere.
That interested in the kind of post-industrial residue, of what was once thriving industries with their own material culture. I've heard you speak in the past on this odd relationship between what we might regard as craft and industry, which I know you come back to in your book. And at times I sense that you're quite hostile to what might be said as the way that craft is understood, if not actually craft as an activity. So is this because it compares unfavourably with what was once an untheorized activity of mass industrial production?
In terms of, say the second half.
I suppose that you seem to have an admiration for something of the ways in which things were made in factories and the ways in which this has produced a lot of disparate material that's now much of it redundant, but has its own beauty or appeal. And yet you're also quite critical of the way that people write about craft or understand craft as an activity. And I wonder if these two, which often seem to people like opposites, if your view of industrial production has given you a rather jaundiced view of the way that people write about craft.
No, I think a lot of people, I mean, if you read, let's say, I mean, I don't think I say anything new that Paul Greenhouse didn't say, or that Edward Lucy Smith, or I mean, there's a lot of surveys of craft out there, which and some of them you might think of as being, Glenn Adamson's books. I think of them as, in some ways, maybe I don't think I'm more critical of. I think I'm critical of how craft is institutionalized. I would say that's how I would put it, because I don't think there's actually a big difference to the person you're talking to who's working in a factory today often, and someone who's not. I am more interested as a historian. I think I'm much more interested in what's representative, and I think that, and I also feel very ill-served by my education that encouraged open-ended creativity, thinking that was either art or craft or anything. So I'd say in some ways it's more of a rebellion against a certain kind of educational, disciplinary formlessness. Although I also think it's very problematic to think about how you would go about teaching a practice in a school. I mean, I taught. I have an MFA, and I taught at Parsons. I taught drawing at Parsons before I decided to go back and get a PhD, because I really thought I couldn't teach people to draw my whole life, because I mean, there's a wonderful way you're teaching people to see, but is this like is this like teaching someone how to jigger bowls, or is this teaching people how to flint snap? I mean, it just seemed like you were always having to make an argument for it in terms of the kind of the current contemporary landscape, and it's a question of what you can do with enthusiasm and conviction, I suppose, because I do think the historical stuff is immense and is awesome, and it's much more. And when you bring students into that kind of, and they feel the kind of the tug of it, it is quite compelling. We do such a poor job of kind of encouraging historical consciousness on that level.
To bring that back to the practice of craft, whatever that might mean, do you think there is a problem that craft people or craft as an activity often has to justify itself, whereas many other activities it's taken for granted it's a perfectly legitimate way of working?
Sure, I think that's, I know many more artists and craft people too who have existential crises about the meaning of their work, and dentists probably do not. Right? I mean, it's perfectly practical, but I don't know if it's. I mean, it's a kind of, what I'm really writing against is a kind of individualism, I think, and then again this open-ended interest in creativity. And I find it much more interesting to ask my students, about their emotional relationship to orange juice than about, their creativity. And everyone in this room probably, really has a very strong feeling about, some pulp, no pulp, or pulp. And it's those, we have emotional relationships to those things that are in some ways much more interesting, I think about than degrees of individualism, individual creativity, and so with that Brancusi, Brancusis are wonderful objects, but I do think you can actually have just as valid an emotional response to that cider press as to a Brancusi. And that's what I'm interested in ultimately, I guess. That kind of space between anonymous objects and kind of question about tooling and, you know, technology and thinking through how something got made. So, you know, maybe my class really are Mondays with Ezra's, you know, madness or something like that. I mean, in terms of thinking through this intersection. And maybe it's just as idiosyncratic as someone's, as taking a class with someone who fosters, you know, their own, you know, aesthetic, which is ultimately what I found art schools and design schools and craft schools to be, a kind of, you know, a kind of parental, you know, expectation where that an aesthetic will be continued more so than anything else. Yeah. I mean, most crits that people give are really encumbering you with their own predispositions more so than questioning whatever is in front of them. And to go to a historical object or an anonymous object, it kind of gets you out of that range. So, yeah.
How do your own practices of making or practices of craft or these experiments like these seats, do these come into your writing at all? And if so, how do they end up being part of your writing?
How do I own?
How do they come into your writing at all when you write? You know, are these just something you do in the background as sort of part of working things out?
Well, no,
do they actually end up being part of your?
I think they are research. I think they're useful research in the end. I think laying a floor helps you understand how wood works.
But you don't actively write about these things, they're just sort of a way of working for you that stays in the background.
I guess they creep in sometimes. But I'm less interested in my own self. I feel like, you know, when I toured the factory with the, you know, and with Neil Brownsword at Wedgwood, and Neil asked the guy working there, how come the plaster sprig molds were this thick? He thought, he's like, well, that's the thickness of my finger. And those kinds of moments where you're just kind of like, you know, making those kinds of questions about process, I think are much more interesting ultimately out there than in here. I think I have empathy through, like, and I think, you know, empathizing with materials is very important, and as well as empathizing with the people who are working there. But I think those are, you know, empathy is a strange and interesting thing in terms of historical empathy and whether we develop empathy and how we develop it, whether we do it too much. Yeah. So I think that all of those come into play, but I try to abstract them, I'd say, more than focus on them, because I think it is a dumb old abstract. I guess I don't think the things I make are so primal. They're great for my parents, you know, but I don't need them anymore. They're just as good as digital images. I check them all.
And with your students, do you ever have making workshops as part of your courses? You know, have you gotten them to sit down and make any baskets yet?
No, I've always thought it was a cop-out in art schools to have students do creative projects instead of writing, because they need to learn how to file their taxes and write a letter of application for a job. And so if they don't know how to write a thesis statement, or if at least I haven't corrected their thesis statement in each of their papers and pushed them and said, what's your argument? I think that I'm not doing my job, really. I'm copying out. So I think this banjo class will be the first time I really totally merge them, you know, and have allowed this spillover.
Well, I think we've just about
exhausted
milked you
me,
for
so, yeah.
everything about your life, career, and your publications. But
Thank
that
you.
was a very interesting way to explore how some of our own students might take their training here into a series of professional and personal interests, and while without duplicating it, it might give some people an idea of where you can go with it.
Or how you can stumble.
Yes. But thanks very much, Ezra.